Hello, everyone. Welcome, and welcome back. My name's Dan the Video Ninja. You all know who I am. And this is my 5th year bringing you all the world-famous, critically acclaimed, award-winning There's an Indie for That panel. And each year I'm happy to return to tell you guys more about some interesting video games that may remind you of some classic games that you might remember from years gone by. Hello, everyone in the chat. Hello, hello, hello. A brief refresher, since I'm sure most of you remember how this works. I've cooked up a list of 10 games I'm sure most of you remember from years and, in some cases, decades gone by, and matched them with some indie titles that have come out more recently that share enough similarities between them that you're sure to be saying to yourself, I like that old thing. I should try this new thing. And that's the ultimate aim here, to show you all that if there's a particular gaming experience that you've been holding on to all these years in your core gaming memories, well, there's an indie for that. One thing, though, before we go any further there, apologies for the false start near the end of the start. I had to chase Khan out of here again. Also, he dropped this on his way out of here. Maybe there's somebody out there who wants this. I don't know. I'll just leave that there for now. So, we're going to talk a little bit about each of these classic old games that I've picked here and have a look at how some of the new indies that I've also picked compare to them. There's sure to be a lot of nostalgic pops here and there, so make sure you flood the chat with emotes and capitalized words and exclamation points and animated emotes and all of those fun things every time the member berries start popping, you know? Now might be a good time to do what Lindsay also did there and grab your notebook and pull up your wish lists in case you spot something on this list here that you're keen on adding down the line. Woo to indies indeed. A little bit of housekeeping before we jump into the list in earnest here. I've got some gameplay footage to show you guys throughout the panel or so. Some of it might have some flashing lights in it or some fast movement or whatever. If you're sensitive to that sort of thing and you need to excuse yourself, feel free to. Nobody's going to judge you. We want everybody to be comfortable throughout the weekend and whatever, so do look after that and be aware that that's on its way. Also, one or two of the entries on my list here might be skirting the edges of our PG-13 rating for this panel and indeed this entire convention. So, nothing too graphic, I promise. I'm not going to be showing you guys like Mortal Kombat fatalities or anything like that. But on the off chance that maybe there's tinier people in the audience watching right now, just, be aware. Viewer discretion is slightly advised. So, with that being said, let's jump in here. We'll start off with the first game on the list. Who remembers God of War? Well, I guess I'm testing out that viewer discretion warning right off the bat here. Straight from the violent, edgy early aughts comes the original PlayStation title God of War, which introduced us all to everyone's favorite god-slaying Spartan rage warrior, Kratos. In his youth, the ghost of Sparta was less of a hairy dad glowering at all the other hairy Viking gods and honing his child-rearing skills, and was instead on a violent revenge campaign against the entire pantheon of his Greek homelands. And to do so, he was jumping, dodging, swimming, and whirling his trademark blades of chaos throughout every historic Greek setting there was, from Athens to Hades, all the way to Mount Olympus itself. What made the original God of War a standout in the early 2000s action-adventure gaming genre was that it had a very satisfying core gameplay loop. Kratos' balletic combat style was a wide departure from the guns and swords that we had spent a lot of years using to fight our way through most video games up until this point. And the developers made sure to keep control of the wild madman as tight and as responsive as possible. Combos were fun to watch, easy to pull off, and satisfying to master, making the Ghost of Sparta a wonderfully powerful avatar for players to enjoy controlling. In addition, a great deal of care and detail was put into recreating dozens of inspired settings and set pieces for the anti-hero to battle through. The ravaged streets of Athens, for example, the monumental labyrinth of the Temple of Pandora, the fleshy hellscapes of Hades, that all popped with vibrant texture and energy that made playing through the game seem as epic as all the Greek mythology had always suggested it was. So with cool levels and a kick-ass power fantasy main character, God of War made a lasting impression as a definitive mythological adventure franchise. Now say it with me, there's an indie for that. This is Raji, an ancient epic. Also a mythological traversal action game. This time our adventure is set in ancient India as we join a young girl named Raji who sets out to challenge a demonic invasion in an attempt to rescue her younger brother and also save the world. You know, that's usually implied. Much like the Ghost of Sparta, Raji has been gifted the power of the gods to aid her on her quest. Hindu gods in this case, instead of, the Greek gods. She has a wide variety of weapons and spells to choose from, along with her own acrobatic talents that let her leap and tumble and dodge around foes in exciting arena battles and thrilling boss encounters. The game is steeped in Indian culture and architecture as well. From the moment you begin, the various traditional art styles, puppet show cutscenes, and traditional music scores are all on full display. The story draws a lot from Hindu and Balinese mythology, and it proves to be just as dense and rich as anything seen in the more popular Greek or Norse mythological settings, with stories of gods and demons and beasts and wondrous landscapes that fill the entire adventure with an excess of vibrant color and culture. And at the center of it all is Raji herself, who stands as a unique contrast to the chisel-jawed protagonists that often headline mythic adventures like this. She's not a warrior, she's not a soldier, she's a circus performer. And she proves to be just as capable as a gaming avatar, thanks to her acrobatic skills, which borrow a little bit more from the leaping and tumbling gameplay of games like the Prince of Persia games, instead of, just the two-fisted punch-up brawls that you see in stuff like God of War or like the Batman games, for example. But this doesn't mean that she can't hold her own in a fight, because near the beginning of the game, she gets herself a magic trident that she wields throughout most of the game. Later on, she gets a magic bow and arrow and other weapons and powers in order to face down all the challenges of this invading demon army that's taking over her homeland. It's a different flavor for an epic adventure that hasn't really been explored too often in too many gaming franchises, and for that reason alone, I think Raji, an ancient epic, is a tale of adventure that shouldn't go overlooked. This one looks really neat. It is really neat, yes. Is she as angry as Kratos? I don't know that anybody can be as angry as Kratos is. But she's definitely, I think she waxes more poetically throughout the story of this game. Because it's less of a revenge story for her and more of a rescue mission. Moving along to the next game. Let's go back quite a ways for the next one. Who remembers The Colonel's Bequest? This is one for the old school adventure game fans. And when we're talking old school adventure games, of course, we're talking good old Sierra point-and-click adventure games from the late 80s and early 90s. The Colonel's Bequest is your straightforward Agatha Christie murder mystery story with a good old point-and-click adventure gameplay that we all remember just about every Sierra game and Sierra Quest from the time having. You can almost tell that this was a Sierra adventure game just from the visuals and art style alone. As these were old DOS games, the color palette was very limited, but also very specific. Games like this that needed to rely heavily on atmosphere and the impact of their settings often had a great amount of detail put into the backgrounds and the character animations, and they used tricks like dithering and high contrast shadows that were necessary to achieve this intended look of a fantasy world or a spooky mansion. This all resulted in Sierra games that always looked like Sierra games. Gameplay was also something that grew a bit of an identity of its own in these games, mostly through clever manipulation of rudimentary tools the developers had at the time. These were, after all, the games that taught us to hoard everything in our inventory that would fit and use it everywhere that we found an item that we could use in a certain spot. We'd have to use everything. You also had to ask every character that you came across about every other character in the game, in the rare hopes that one of the dozen ask blank about blank commands would trigger the next plot points. That's, like I said, what made Sierra games play like Sierra games. They may have been telling rudimentary stories that have been told in books and films many, many times by this point. But these early Sierra games and their ilk were really a fresh new interactive way to present these stories. These games paved the way for what we all know as adventure games today. And there's so many indies for these ones, but oh boy, have I got a specific one for this. This is the Crimson Diamond. And I believe this one qualifies for this year's Did You Change the Video, Dan award, because I'm willing to bet that those of you out there who are only half paying attention to this panel are probably thinking that I still have that 35-year-old gameplay footage on screen right now. Many of the games on my lists year after year aim to pay homage to their inspiration, but I think this might be the game that tries the most to look exactly like it. Make no mistake, this is a game developed just last year, and when it was announced last summer, the fact that it looks like a game that came right off of some 3.5-inch floppy disks from the bottom of someone's junk drawer, that was in fact the principal selling point of the game. 3.5-inch floppy disk. Man, I'm old. This is another early 20th century story, this time set in a small town right here in Ontario, Canada, actually, and it follows a young mystery-solving woman named Nancy Maple, very cute, as she investigates the appearance of a mysterious diamond found in a tiny little town by a local fisherman. Soon after she begins her investigation, the plot contrivances kick in that force her into the familiar Agatha Christie setup of trying to figure out what's going on, why people are turning up dead, and who's profiting from it all. Everything that you can remember from games like this from back in the day has been added back into this game on purpose and with love. The graphics and sound mimic the old VGA color palette and sound blaster audio quality of early PC games, and you'll spend most of this game amassing yet another catalog of inventory items from anything that isn't bolted down that you can pick up. Plus, this is another one of those games where you can have like 100,000 different save slots. So, you know, when you go through it, make sure to name every single one of those save slots some wacky name that'll help you remember where it is that you are in the game. And you're going to need them too, by the way, because you can also die in this game a lot. Like King Graham levels of death in this game. So, yeah, use those save slots for sure. The Crimson Diamond, it doesn't try to be anything but exactly what it is. The solo developer had a singular focus when she made this game, and if you happen to share her particular love for exactly one kind of classic old-school PC adventure game, this is the game for you. Lots of death, absolutely. Definitely a nostalgic color palette. Not an attractive one, but nostalgic. Oh yeah, for sure. We've come a long way with graphics, so, you know, obviously this is definitely of a time. As usual, I'm going to leave this panel with more games than I can play in a whole year. Perfect. That's exactly what I was going for. All right, stepping back in time, since we're still doing games about investigating and mystery solving, who remembers Sherlock Holmes, Consulting Detective? Once again, dipping our toes into the ancient realms of early DOS games. This time we're taking a look at a classic, if somewhat also very aged, detective game starring the world's most famous fictional crime solver, Sherlock Holmes. There's somebody in the chat who remembers this one. I'm always counting on that. The Consulting Detective games were among the first games available to feature live-action footage of real actors staging scenes and conversations on sets and in costumes. This was something that most people associate more with later games of the 90s when CD-ROM technology came along, but here, the lengthy dialogue scenes serve as more of an interactive and theatrical method of providing players with kind of a deluge of information to sift through. And that was what made these early detective games stand out from the more conventional point-and-click adventure games that we were just talking about. Buried within the hundreds of addresses and pages of notes was all the information needed for the player to solve whatever case they and Holmes were on. All it took was a keen eye for detail, a good memory, and a lot of patience to work the solutions out. Plenty of games, even back in the early years of PC adventures, would put you in the shoes of someone trying to solve a crime or bring evildoers to justice, but often you were just going through whatever stages and scenes the narrative had in a linear order, much like you would if you were just, reading one of the old Sherlock Holmes books or watching a film adaptation. But when game developers finally sort of cracked the secret for how to make players think like real detectives and go looking for their own clues and their own answers to the questions that they're asking themselves, that's when we truly got really great games like Sherlock Holmes, the Consulting Detective. And there's an indie for that. This is The Rise of the Golden Idol. So fast forward several decades, and along comes some indie game developers that breathed new life into detective games. Developers like Lucas Pope and his hit game Return of the Obra Dinn that everybody loved, or Sam Barlow and games like Her Story. This new wave of deductive-based puzzle-solving games, when we've seen those come up, we've seen two games kind of like those pop up in the form of these Golden Idol games that you're seeing on the screen right now that center around the titular Golden Idol and its mysterious power. I think this one's already on my wish list. Dang it, I'll have to try harder next year. These games may simply be a collection of snapshots in history of certain events surrounding the Golden Idol itself and who has it and what they're doing with it throughout the 19th and 20th century. But there's so many details in every one of the scenes that pop up in a game like this that are practically just begging for the player to just step up and create their own story themselves just by looking through all the details and notes and conversations. And that's exactly what you need to do. Each scene that you come to in a game like this will also come with a little empty Mad Lib style question sheet that you have to fill out correctly in order to progress the story. And the only way that you can do that is to sift through all of the names and places and notes and conversations and clues and evidence left out in plain sight. The game pretty much just leaves you to your own devices and only steps in to confirm your theories and conclusions when you've already got the scene more or less figured out. Each completed scene, in turn, then becomes a piece of the bigger, wider puzzle that spans the entirety of the whole game. And by the time you get near the end of the hours of scenes and content contained within these games, you'll have an entire scrapbook full of names and details to pour back through in order to deduce the story's final mysteries. But those who are able to connect all the dots and get out their corkboards and strings and whatnot and put all of the pieces together will definitely receive the truest of those aha moments. And those are really what we're all in playing games like this for, are we not? So this one is one to recommend for that sort of thing. Kind of like a certain ongoing mystery hunt. Yeah, how's that going? Is everybody having a good time with that so far? My Sherlock Holmes obsessed friends are loving this game right now. Yeah, it's one for the brainy people out there. It's one for the thinkers. But we're not here just to talk about puzzle games and adventure games all day long. So how about we take a step away from that and get to something a little juicier, shall we? Who remembers Hexen? Oh, you all knew that the first-person shooter games from the late 90s were going to show up in this list eventually. Here's Hexen, which took an extremely popular genre of first-person shooters and decided, okay, what about first-person shooters, but what if Dungeons and Dragons instead of like Terminator or Aliens? Technically, Hexen is a sequel to another first-person sword and sorcery game called Heretic, but honestly, these games are old enough that anyone that remembers them probably couldn't tell you the difference between them. Anyway, as you might have already figured out just from the footage alone, the appeal of these games was that they took the very popular but by no accounts fast-paced, we'll say, settings that players were imagining their way through when they were playing their tabletop fantasy games and injected them with all the speed and technology of then modern PC gaming in order to let players just blitz around levels, shooting fireballs and swinging battle axes without having to stop and roll dice every second or two. And it worked. Players got the satisfaction of decimating entire armies of cool-looking monsters with all the visceral detail that on-screen graphics could afford. Plus, they got some additional perks on loan from the tabletop routes of games, like the fantastical settings, and even like multiple classes and unique weapons that the player character could try out. You weren't always just stuck as the same Space Marine, you know? It didn't have bullets or rockets and demons, but a game like Hexen and other sword and sorcery action games like this were the first of the various non-gun centered first-person shooter games to come out during the first-person shooter craze of the 90s. And the era of action gaming was richer for it, if you ask me. It gave people a nice alternative, like I said, from just being some dude in a Space Marine mask grunting your way through explosions and fire all day. And there is an indie for this one, too. This is a Medieval. Welcome, champions. This is a Medieval, and it comes to us from the so-called boomer shooter wave of the last half dozen years or so. There's really nothing much more to be said about this game that the footage that you're seeing on screen doesn't already say for me. This is a fast-paced first-person shooter action game using cool, juiced-up fantasy weapons. And it's meant to look perplexingly like a game simultaneously very old school, yet with a modern polish and shine to it. The game doesn't waste any time overcomplicating your experience with a needlessly elaborate setup. There's several fantastical realms that have already been conquered by evil forces, and the player character, known as the God's Champion, that's all we ever learn about the player's avatar, you're just the champion. You've been sent to smite evil out of all of these realms with an entire arsenal of crazy powerful weapons. That's about the long and short of it, really. Medieval's weapons are easily the standout aspect of this game, whether it's magic wands that shoot rapid-fire homing shots, sabers that slice giant shockwaves into the air, maces that will pin enemies to the wall with crystal shrapnel. It's got everything. There's even, I kid you not, a gnarly staff in this game that lets you literally launch entire miniaturized planets at foes. You know, who needs a rocket launcher when you've got that kind of firepower? And forget demonic hellscapes, futuristic tech bases, or sewers. The worlds that you'll be saving are bursting with color and unique architecture in this game. There isn't a single shade of brown anywhere to be found in these levels at all. Plus, despite the game running fine on a toaster, if you're the sort that wants to really push your graphics card to the limit, there's RTX lighting options in this game that will definitely give your gear a very healthy workout. Arm yourself up and get out there and save the universe in this throwback first-person shooter game that wraps itself in beauty and badass weaponry. Evil's waiting for you, champions. Get out there. Magic shooting. Yeah, you shoot a lot of magic in this game. And it's pretty quick, too. Like, you can see some of those enemies on the screen there. They're not just going to stand put and wait for you to shoot them down. They're coming after you, so you better be on your toes in a game like this. Magic missile, now with more missiles. Yeah, this is like an upcasted level 30 magic missile, I think, is what you're dealing with in this game. Taking another step back, we're going to stick with the first-person shooters, though. So let's go back a little bit in time here. Who remembers Outlaws? Here's a gunslinging Western-themed shooter from everyone's favorite 90s publisher, LucasArts, if you can believe it. And in true LucasArts fashion, their aim was to make a game that wasn't chasing after the trends that games like Doom and Quake were making at the time, but instead they wanted to use the medium to explore a popular genre and setting and give a game feel to that setting that hadn't quite been seen to this point. So this is set in a stereotypical but beautifully rendered Wild West frontier, and the player dons the gun belt and hat of a former marshal turned family man who takes up his pistols once again when his loving wife is murdered and his daughter is kidnapped by an over-the-moon, capital E, evil land baron and the criminals that they employ. I did say this was stereotypical, didn't I? From then on, it's just one down and out shootout after another as our heroes battle their way through dozens of thugs and outlaws at a time. What made this game truly sing, though, was a few subtle tweaks to the FPS gameplay that really lent it to feeling like being in a period-appropriate gun battle. Weapons in this game fire quickly, and the player has to be just as quick to reload every single bullet or shell to keep up with the pace of the battle. This meant that that time really was your best and greatest resource, because you had to manage all of your bullets in this game, because they were just as lethal as they are in real life. Enemies don't really soak up a whole lot of damage from the bullets in this game. So getting another round into your pistol faster than the other guy who just spun around the corner and spotted you really was the cincher to whether or not you were going to win that gunfight and survive to move on to the next stage. Around the mechanics, there was more signature LucasArts polish, like I said, with stunning animated cutscenes, complete with full voice acting and cinema-level scoring and editing. There's some big voice acting names, actually, in the cutscenes in this game. Outlaws may not have been it might have been telling the same cowboy story we've all heard a dozen times and seen in a dozen movies or so, but it spared no expense on the presentation of such a tale in this game. And this was a game that looked and felt the way that I think we all imagined exciting battles and adventures of this setting must have looked and felt. The very chaotic, dustied up gunfights, shooting from windows to windows and so on, that kind of feeling. And also told a story that was full of cliches, for sure. I mean, you know, like I told you the plot synopsis of this game, and I'm sure it sounded like half a dozen different Western movies that we've all seen. But you can see on the screen there that they spared no expense with the animation budget, that's for sure, especially in those cutscenes there. And it has such a charm and a charisma that players couldn't help but get swept up in the thrill of being an old Western gunslinger in a game like this. Because it would be a while before something like Red Dead Redemption would come along to show us what a game like this could be like with modern graphics. So this is what we had back in the day, and a lot of people sort of glazed over it, but those that did manage to pick it up and fall in love with it, I think, have a lot of nostalgia for it. And there's an indie for that. This is Fallen Aces. And it should be pretty apparent right from the start that we're no longer doing the gunslinging Western setting, but instead we're in a gritty, pulpy, two-fisted, hard-boiled detective story straight out of the comic book pages and film screens of the mid-20th century. Don't worry, though. This isn't going to be like the third clue-hunting detective game we're going to talk about on this list. The game's detective protagonist has a lot more Dick Tracy or Batman in him rather than Sherlock Holmes or Hercule Poirot. Once again, the presentation is what really sells a game like this. Just like how Outlaws set the scene of your typical spaghetti western, here we have the grimy setting, thuggish lingo, and art design of a crime-soaked streets of a corrupted city somewhere, and our hard-drinking, tough guy detective main character has to battle his way through it all. And instead of the polished 2D artistic animated cutscenes filling us in on the plot points between missions, in a game like this, instead we get literal comic book panels and radio drama dialogue telling us the story instead. And the voice actors all commit to really having that old school radio drama feel to their performance. The gameplay follows suit as well, trading up the hectic chaos of dusty shootouts like we were talking about in a little deserted frontier town with white-knuckled brawls in clubs and alleys and seedy watering holes. There are still guns in this game, and you can do quite a bit of shooting here, but for the most part, since the hero, Jack, is meant to be more of like a chiseled bruiser and like a boxer type guy, you'll spend most of the game handing out beatings with whatever improvised weapons or two-fisted boxing moves you can manage. If you've had your fill of first-person shooter games set either against demonic hordes or off in some far-off modern war somewhere and are looking for a power fantasy trip in a cool setting that hasn't quite been tapped in this medium quite like this, there's a lot of exciting bone-crunching action in fancy suits and fancy hats to be found in an indie gem like this. I love how we're getting all these different art styles. Indeed. It's pretty brutal, though, this one. Like I said, some of these are, like, it might look like a cartoon or whatever. This one's not for the kids, but it's pretty good. Yeah, so I think it's enough shooting or whatever. Let's switch gears once again here. Who remembers Caesar 3? That's wild and out of nowhere, isn't it? Okay, in truth, this particular member berry should really extend to just about every ancient or futuristic civilization management game that was popular on the PC in the 90s. Stuff like Pharaoh or Outpost or Settlers, for example. But for the purpose of our little discussion here, we'll focus on the Caesar series, which involves players needing to build up and maintain ancient Roman settlements and eventually grow them into a mighty empire as the one and only Caesar. Similar to the granddaddy of all city-building games, SimCity in this case, games like this required the player to carefully manage all the resources and place farms, homes, temples, and other structures in the most optimal manner in order to allow citizens to grow and thrive. Depending on how the player chose to advance their civilization, you might also have to sometimes develop a military force to ward off foreign invaders, which could eat up valuable resources that you also need to closely monitor. So these games were really the bread and butter for gamers who loved diving in and out of menus and stat screens and carefully managing which structures were producing what and what sections of the population were responsible for each duty that they were required to do. It gave players a lot of information to crunch through, and if that was your thing back in the day, then you could manage all of the numbers and charts and decisions that had to be made. You could find yourself wielding the power of an entire empire at your fingertips. There was a lot of appeal to that. City builders were kind of a novelty when they first showed up, but they quickly moved beyond just building a moving city made up of different colored squares into a complex, evolving puzzle. And they often came with colorful wrappings in the forms of long-gone civilizations, or maybe even futuristic civilizations, and fantastical worlds spread throughout them. And there's an indie for that. This is Against the Storm. This is a city builder unlike anything you've probably ever seen before. We're in a fantasy setting right now this time around, in which a perpetual world-ending storm has been raging for generations, and you must step into the role of the viceroy to the all-powerful Scorched Queen to venture out into the wilds and establish hamlets and colonies in order to bolster her power enough so that she can fight the storm back and bring a sense of order to the land. The main hook of this particular city building game seems to stem from the developers understanding that the best part of city builders is usually the beginning of a brand new city, when the land is fresh and you have like ample starting supplies and all of your aspirations on what your new colony will become are real fresh in your mind. So with that in mind, this game here is centered around not just building one massive, ever-expanding city and trying to manage it over hours and days and whatnot, but instead, you'll be progressing in this game from fresh colony to fresh colony and building up one colony after another individually, sticking around only long enough just to fulfill a set list of objectives before moving on and starting anew. This routine of constantly beginning a new settlement every few hours or so gives the game kind of a real roguelike feel to it. You're never going to have every single building and resource available to you every single time you start a new map. So you have to think on your feet and learn how to adapt to whatever resources or conditions or objectives that you end up with. Sometimes focusing on the needs of your workers will help you succeed. Other times you might have to strike out and venture into the hostile surrounding areas around your settlement in order to find what you need in order to fulfill your objectives. So you may never achieve a massive metropolis or a globe-spanning empire after hundreds of hours spent on one patch of land, but in Against the Storm, it does have a sense of progression as you work towards securing the lands around you from the destruction that threatens it. And it does so by giving you a nearly endless string of small cities to build up and defend. It's one of the most unique takes on the city building genre, and it'll give dedicated and patient players hundreds of hours of planning, learning, and building to enjoy. Before the citizens revolt, yeah, if you don't make your citizens happy. Although in this game, they don't necessarily revolt, they just leave. They kind of abandoned you in this game if you don't take care of them, so you gotta keep your eye on that as well. Pretty complicated, this one, too. It's got a lot of menus. Again, if your thing is diving in and out of a lot of menus and crunching a lot of information, this game is pretty complicated. But how about something a little less complicated? Who remembers Peggle? Come on, admit it. Even the most hardcore of you out there farted around with this little game back in the day. If not this, then maybe one of the other 100 PopCap games that were all the rage for a hot minute there in the Audies before Angry Bird showed up. This one and its cousin Bejeweled really were the first wave of those bright, shiny, colorful little carnival games centered around exactly one gameplay mechanic that paved the way for virtually the entire mobile gaming industry that quickly followed in its wake. Zuma's another one, yep. So if you've been under several rocks for several decades and you don't know what this is, Peggle was the video game equivalent of a pachinko machine that tasked players with launching little pinballs into the playing field full of pegs that cleared when they were struck. And the object was to clear as many pegs as you could in as few shots as you could. Dressed up all around that one core concept was all kinds of flashing lights and sounds and colors and cute animal mascots and tiny power-up gimmicks, but that was essentially it. I actually have no idea what this is, but Zuma was my jam. Well, they were aiming for the same pleasure centers in your brain, so and they were hugely popular for like a brief moment there. But how did something like this become so popular in the tiny window that it was popular? Well, like pachinko machines that inspired it, this is really a game about literally taking your best shot, and once you loose a ball, all that's left to do is just sort of sit back and let chaos theory do all the work for you. That's why all the sounds and fury was laid across the presentation and why there was so much fanfare when you managed to pull off a particularly tricky shot. This is a game whose DNA harkens back to what were essentially lottery machines. So all the fireworks and fanfare were there to really convince you that you were a master of this game, rather than just being really lucky at it. All of that probably makes it sound like I'm criticizing the game for its gimmicks. I'm not. You know, Balatro had a lot of the same design philosophies, and look how many awards that game took home last year, right? Sometimes we don't want to spend hours poring over menus or memorizing controller inputs or squirming over dialogue choices. Sometimes when we play games, we just want to pull the handle or push the button and see what happens. And there's an indie for that. This is Peglin. And I'm breaking my own rules for this panel already on this one, because usually my mission statement is find newer indie games similar to in theme and game feel as the old ones. And this one only gets about halfway there, I think. Peglin is the same pachinko chaos theory gameplay, but now we're adding in a bunch of the stuff that I just praised the last game for leaving out. We're adding in menus and strategy and planning and etc. Peglin mashes together Peggle, which we were just talking about, and the more recent popular roguelike games, specifically stuff like Slay the Spire in this case. Now your efforts, each time you launch a ball into the playing field, will translate directly into how effectively you're able to beat the little turn-based RPGs that are tacked onto the top side of the screen there. Racking up higher peg counts per ball or hitting certain pegs will build up a combo and unleash special attacks that do damage and whittle down your RPG opponents. So the balls that you collect as well are going to change as well, because you'll acquire new balls that you can fire out with specific properties like extra bounciness, or maybe they'll split into multi-balls. And each time you clear an encounter, you'll get to pick new rewards or upgrade your existing arsenal however you see fit. This brings the game in line a lot more with those sort of deck building type games like Slay the Spire or Monster Train or that kind of thing, as you'll always have to look for synergies when you're choosing what rewards you want to pick after every battle, and you have to make sure that your collection doesn't fill up with and get too bloated with stuff that's less effective than other stuff that you could be selecting. So, yeah, in the same paragraph, I championed Peggle for being simple and no nonsense. I can't help but also recommend something like this that adds in some fun new twists to said generic formula. That's kind of the fun of exploring these indie games, I find. And hey, now you can say that you've at least heard of this particular combination of two games that you probably didn't expect someone out there to mash together. I definitely played a lot of Peggle. Yeah, somehow I feel like those who actually did play it played a lot of it. Doesn't seem like one of those games that you just play for like an hour and then forget all about, is it? On the hunt for more member berries. Let's go back in time and check out another old classic. This one, some of you might have heard of. It's called The Legend of Zelda. Okay, so this is a treat for me since I probably don't have to go into too much detail about what this is, right? But for the benefit of any younger folk in the audience, we are talking about the original NES classic that kicked off the whole franchise. And in that sense, we're talking about a game that plays a little different than most of the more recent 3D Zelda games. Not all of them, surely. Link Between Worlds and Breath of the Wild were certainly hearkening back to some of the core principles from this early entry, no doubt. So, what are we talking about here? Well, this was before Crystals, this was before Kakariko Village, this was before even the Master Sword. This was an adventure that started out with a gigantic map that none of us had memorized yet, and a little green dude plunked right at the bottom of it with barely a screen's worth of text giving you the basic idea of what's up. And that was it. Off you go. You don't know where anything is. You don't know how anything works. You've got to just find things, try them in places, and hope you don't take a wrong turn somewhere that leads you into something that you are nowhere near prepared for. Was this better than the slew of tutorials and dialogue explanations right out of the gate like most adventure games do nowadays? That depends really on your tolerance for such things, but this is what it was like back then. I was there, Gandalf, 3,000 years ago. And whether or not this stripped-down, no-hands-holding approach to an adventure works for your personal tastes or not, it didn't stop this little title from the mind of a funny little man from Japan from turning into the number 2 video gaming franchise of all time. There's something to be said for the basics, really. Simple controls and tools that get better as you play, more world space that opens up as you play, and a sense of exploration and discovery that never diminishes as you play. Sometimes that's all it took. And there's an indie for that. This is Mini Shoot Adventures. It's kind of amazing how often my little adventure in If You Like This, Then You'll Like This, that this panel is all based around, takes kind of a left turn sometimes into the realm of if you like this and this, here they are together. So with that in mind, here's Mini Shoot Adventures, which reimagines the original 1986 classic NES adventure that we were just talking about, but swaps out the swords, bombs, and arrows for a tiny little twin-stick shooter on an adventure through a land of bullet hell challenges. Now, before anyone cries foul on me, hear me out on this one. If it's still top-down, up-down, left-right exploration. You're still going in and out of caves and dungeons, looking for secrets and treasures that will help you progress further into the game. And the story is still less than a half page of written notes that amounts to little more than, there's evil, go do something about it. So you can see the similarities, but at its core, this is a twin-stick shooter along the lines of, God, there's got to be so many of them out there to choose from. Geometry Wars, I guess, is the first one that I can think of, but I'm sure many of you out there can probably think of other ones. What that means, though, is that you're using one analog stick on your controller, if you're playing on a controller, to move the ship around, and you're using the other analog stick to fire a constant stream of pew-pew-pew shots in whatever direction you hold it in. It's a bit of a departure from swinging the Master Sword around, but beyond that, you know the drill, and the presentation in this game, just look at it. It's fantastic. It's colorful. It's vibrant. It's very video gamey, if that makes any sense. This is a wonderful little spin on the classic formula that can and will find an audience, young and old, from any generation of gamer. Because games like this that are designed with this kind of aspect and core gameplay feel to them, they'll always find an audience, young and old. That doesn't look like a person, Dan. It's not. It's a little ship. It might have a person in it, but they're all little ships. I have played a lot of this one. Yeah, I played this one on my stream. People got a kick out of it. Back in time, once again, back to another old classic. Who remembers The Adventures of Lolo? This one's almost as old as the last classic we looked at, but here's a cute little block-pushing puzzle game from ages ago that saw yet another tiny mascot character venturing out to save a princess from an evildoer that has locked her away in the castle. Which was a style at the time. But this time around, we're in full thinky, brainy puzzle-solving territory once again, because our little hero can only push blocks around the room and try his best to stay out of the sights of all the hostile nasties that appear in every single room. It may never have soared to the heights of other simple puzzle games of the time, like Tetris, for example, nor was it a boundary-pushing powerhouse of an adventure like what Mario and Link were doing in their games, but this game, and its many sequels actually, were kind of patient zero for lateral thinking puzzle games, long before most of us even knew what those were. That's right, kids. Stuff like the Talos Principle, stuff like Braid, even your beloved Portal, those games all kind of trace their roots back to tiny little blue guys pushing around blocks in a single little square room, you know? Often in games like this, where you had an entire room puzzle laid out before you, it was common to try and map out the solution in your head long before your character took their first steps. It's kind of like chess, you know? There was an element of trying to second guess the game every turn and devise a solution to the puzzle one step at a time in your head, which made games like this ideal for younger players who were just beginning to learn how to make connections between thoughts and how they could be applied to a problem. You know, all video games were about teaching players how to solve problems, but it was early lateral puzzle-solving games like The Adventures of Lolo here that were the most predominant crystallization of that concept. And the kids that fell in love with games like this probably went on to become galaxy brain-level puzzle solvers later on in life. And boy, oh boy, is there an indie for this one. This is Isles of the Sea and Sky. And this takes the core aspect of Lolo's block-pushing puzzles and dumps 3.5 decades of indie game design and quality-of-life updates all over it to create a truly spiritual successor to the original single-screen interactive puzzle games before the turn of the century. In this game, you can travel across a vast ocean on the back of a giant turtle, which is adorable, to a bunch of different islands full of puzzles to solve and secrets to find. The first big change for the better in this is that unlike the straightforward level-by-level approach that the older games were kind of forced into, this one is truly non-linear. This is a very non-linear adventure that players can approach any way they want. It's got sort of like that hub-based early 3D exploration game setup, kind of like Mario 64 or Banjo-Kazooie, where you can dive in and out of levels and solve whichever puzzles you like in whatever order you like. As well, there are occasional exploration side quests that often break off from the puzzles and instead let the player wander off and look for secrets, kind of like a Zelda game. There's also far more puzzles available in this game than you need for progression. So if you get stuck on a particularly hard one, you can just leave it and go and try something else. This is good because this is definitely an easy to learn, hard to master type game. And as you get further in, some of the puzzles start to get really challenging in this game. Luckily, instead of the tired old lives system that meant you had to start the whole game over if you failed a puzzle too many times, this game does the very easy fix, and it just offers you as many room resets and undos as you could possibly need. You can just press a button and undo every last move that you did all the way back to when you started a room. Hell, you can press another button and just reset the entire room entirely. The game doesn't penalize you for it at all. It's about giving you the tools and the time you need to come up with your own solution to these puzzles, and I think that's what really kind of drove me to really want to check this game out and show you guys this. So the adventures waiting for you in the Isle of Sea and Skies have been well crafted using some old but solid blueprints that have been refined for a modern gaming audience. It invites you in with charming pixel art and smooth, comfortable retry and undo mechanics, but it also has more than enough beefy challenges waiting in store for even the most die-hard puzzle fanatics to sink their teeth into. Puzzle games are the best. Yes. I love those functions. Yeah, they did a good job of making a very hard puzzle game that's very easy to get frustrated at, but also not for it. It's very fair. It's just very hard. Die hard puzzle fanatics unite. I'll bet you this would be a game for you guys to unite over. If you're ever going to try this game on your own without looking for help from a walkthrough, good luck. Put it this way, I couldn't even finish this game. Not on my own. But in any case, let's go back in time a little bit more here. Who remembers Fez? Quite a lot of puzzle games this year, huh? I think I broke it up with 1 or 2 action games there, but yeah, I guess I'm just on a puzzle game tangent this year. Anyway, this one doesn't quite go as far back as some of the other Memberberry games do, but I'm sure some of us out there for whom this charming little title was a core gamer memory experience, yeah, it's there. Fez was a perspective-shifting puzzle platforming game that had cryptic riddles and ciphers woven into its very DNA. And when it arrived on the scene over a decade ago, there was quite the buzz about its mind-bending approach to puzzle gameplay. Most of us had been used to puzzles in video games existing within like the context of the game itself, for example, or even just the room itself that you were in. A puzzle in a game like Adventures of Lolo, for example, was one screen. A game like Zelda, the puzzles were like in one dungeon. The whole dungeon might be a puzzle, but it was contained within that one dungeon. But that was that. And this is Fez. Fez came along and asked everybody to look everywhere throughout the whole game, and even outside of the game sometimes, to find answers to some of its puzzles. You had to write stuff down sometimes, or draw your own maps, or even scan QR codes in order to get your solutions. And then you had to wrap your head around the rotating perspective mechanic on top of that. So what made this game even more refreshing, though, like the previous one that we were just talking about, was that it took a very soft approach to challenging game players, rather. There was no pressure involved in the gameplay in this game. There were no timers. There was no monsters. There wasn't even really a fail state in this game. If you missed a jump or whatever, it just warped you back to where you jumped from, like nothing happened. So you could just jump around and and dive and look for secrets, however, and you weren't really worried about getting penalized at all. So you could stop your sleuthing, or stop sitting there trying to think of the puzzles or whatever, and just relax and just enjoy the gorgeous 3D rendered art that the game was just bursting with. Fez challenged puzzle solvers to truly think outside the game box in order to reach its deepest secrets, and there was a revelry not just in finding the solutions, but discovering new ways to find those solutions. The uncertainty of wondering if a hidden door led to new information became just as much of a thrill as actually unlocking the door itself. And players spent hours spinning the world of Fez around and around, looking for every last secret that they could find. And there's an indie for that. This is Animal Well. This one flew under the radar for most players, with the exception of those players out there who made up the exact target audience the game was aiming for. Animal Well had no pretense about being anything but exactly what it looked like. It was a dense Metroidvania puzzle platformer packed to the brim and beyond, with hidden passages, cryptic messages, and oodles of treasure and secrets to find. So this one's maybe not as cozy as Fez had been, but Animal Well served up instead a kind of dark and hauntingly beautiful subterranean world to explore. It was known as The Well, and in which you start off the game as an unknown little no-name blob character that just kind of wakes up in the well. You're not told where you are or what's going on or where to go beyond, a little bit of like Alice in Wonderland style rabbit following. The hunt begins then to search the tunnels and see what kind of rewards and stories are waiting for you at the end of each one of them. While there is no world rotating mechanic this time around, The Well more than makes up for that by being one of the largest interconnected Metroid-style maps ever packed into a single game. Tunnels and paths in this game will all seem to dead end more often than not. until the player is able to approach them from a different angle or with a new tool that they can use to press further beyond any of the obstacles that are stopping them. And those looking to fill out the entire map will have hours of work and wandering ahead of them, believe me. But the secrets in this game aren't just exploratory. There's odd clues littered throughout the landscape, and some of them will take some serious gray matter to figure out where they go and what they even mean. Searching for every last mystery in this game will take players beyond the walls and of the game itself and well beyond the credit screens, and possibly even into the real world, looking up stuff online or through different forums and chats and whatnot. If you're brave enough to seek out everything that this game has to offer without the help of a written guide or advice from other players, you may never find all the secrets in Animal Well. Well, we made it, guys. That was my list. What'd you think? Like I said, very, very puzzle heavy, huh? Oh yeah, this is still lying around, by the way. Guess I should do something with that. But that's the list for this year, everyone. Thanks, everybody, for joining me. Hopefully you had fun remembering some older games and discovering some new ones. Thanks again to Kanji for giving me this opportunity to gush about indie games here in this wonderful virtual convention. It's always a treat, and I hope to keep the discussion going throughout the weekend over on the Video Games channel on Kanji's official Discord. So if you haven't already joined that, be sure to get on that. There's channels on there for gaming, cosplay, and even silly meme channels. It's a lot of fun. So I'm going to close down and hand the reins back over to Lindsay, and that's it for me for now. Stay tuned for, what is it, K-pop coming up next, I believe? That should be fun. And I'll see everybody later this afternoon for drinks and dancing after the masquerade. My name's Dan the Video Ninja. Everybody enjoy the rest of Kanji. See ya!